So I will share this screen and just go ahead and give me a quick thumbs up if you're able to see this. Okay. So intersectionality was coined in 1989 by American lawyer Kimberly Crenshaw, who is also one who studies very much around race and critical race theory. She, in 1989, described this term as being related to various overlapping points with race, with gender, with other characteristics. Specifically, I'll read, with Black women as the starting point, it becomes more apparent how dominant conceptions of discrimination condition us to think about subordination as disadvantage occurring along a single categorical axis. I want to suggest further that this single axis framework erases Black women in the conceptualization, identification, and remediation of race and sex discrimination by limiting inquiry to the experiences of otherwise privileged members of the group. For me, the sort of best way for me to understand what she's referring to is to think of a Venn diagram where instead of having characteristics that are sort of running parallel to one another on this sort of single axis framework that she talks about, they're actually overlapping. So Kimberly Crenshaw had referenced a case that was between 5 Black women who were working at General Motors and their employer, which was General Motors. And they were trying to convince their employer that they were discriminated because they were Black women. The employer and the judge noted that there were Black men who were employed at General Motors and there were white women. So therefore, these Black women, the hybridity of being a Black woman, did not exist because there was Blackness and there was whiteness and not the overlap that you find, a unique overlap with Black women. You can find, certainly on this Venn diagram, all sorts of other overlaps. For our conversation today, we'll overlap race and overlap gender as we talk about African American women, but you can certainly overlap with someone like James Baldwin, for instance, sexuality, nationality, race, and gender, and all sorts of other characteristics. So thinking again about the hybridity or the hyphenation between these characteristics as opposed to just sort of a single axis. I think another way to think about this is to take a look at politics, which I know is a very hot topic right now, and I won't go too deep into anything current, but I think if we can conceptualize this concept that we are unique and that we have various nuances that make us individuals that should be recognized, that seems like an obvious enough concept, but in practicality, in all actuality, it doesn't necessarily work that way. So just sort of a quick overview to show how this concept of wholeness and recognizing these multi-layered characteristics of people don't actually play out when we think about systems. So one system being politics. If we take a look way back, 1776 actually, white men were allowed to vote. 1790 naturalization law passed, and it specifically said free white immigrants could become citizens who then could vote. A few years later in New Jersey, 1807, African American and women who could vote, the law changed, saying that they no longer could. It was only related to male citizens. In 1856, North Carolina became the last state where all white men, could vote. Again, therefore, on this single axis, denying women, denying Black or anyone else who was not a white male. Later, after the civil rights into the Reconstruction period, the 14th Amendment, where formerly enslaved people could become citizens, which would allow for a pathway to be able to vote. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we know, had used the 14th Amendment to showcase that actually also applied 100 years later to women. The 15th Amendment, also in that same period, Reconstruction period after the Civil War, said that you could not deny someone the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It did not include sex. So therefore, being a Black woman did not allow you that privilege to be able to vote. We can continue to go on as it relates to other sort of hyphenations of nationality and of gender and of race. 1876 ruled that the Native Americans were not citizens and therefore that they could not vote. It boggles my mind that any sort of act needed to have the word exclusion in it. But in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act barred people of Chinese ancestry from becoming U.S. citizens, therefore barring their pathway to voting. This year, 2020, marked the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which allowed for women, specifically white women, to be able to vote, as there was great, in practice, discrimination around Asian women, around Black women, around Native American women. Continuing on, a few years later, the Supreme Court ruled that if you're of Japanese heritage, you were not eligible to become a citizen, therefore you could not have this pathway to vote. I share these as historical sort of reminders, again, about how a concept of just understanding someone's nuances and hybridities seems obvious enough, but again, in practice, it's so institutionalized where we have this either or thinking, where it's very much, as Kimberly Crenshaw says, on a single axis, where we are able to sort of judge or categorize someone. So for this conversation, as it relates to music, thinking about Black women who had issues as it relates to stereotypical issues, as it relates to discrimination issues around Blackness, and as they have discriminatory issues related to being a woman, the compounded nature in which they were working in is one that I think is very important to their story, and it's also very important to their rise to be able to push through that and to be successful in their own way. So as I shared, I have hopefully 4 we can get to, as well as some audio examples of African American women who had various different interactions and struggles, perseverances as it relates to this sort of intersectionality around race and around gender. The first that I would love to share with you is Florence Price. Okay, so the first person that I would love to share with you is Florence Price. Florence Price may be a name that you have heard of recently. She is a fantastic, phenomenal, beautiful composer who has a really interesting story that I think is getting sort of a resurgency right now. She lived and actually passed away in Chicago, and her old home in Chicago had boxes and boxes of things in her attic. And so when a couple moved in recently, within the past 5 or 6 years, I believe, and found all of this stuff, they realized that it was Florence Price's letters and manuscripts and music that previously had been thought to have been forgotten or buried along with her. So she is recently becoming a name that is maybe more of a household than some of the others that we might talk about today, but certainly still has her story that I would love to share with you. So Florence Price, while she lived in Chicago, she was actually from Little Rock, Arkansas, and she grew up in an upper middle class family. Her father was a dentist, a rather well-regarded dentist who had both Black and white clientele. Her mother was an educator and an elementary school educator, and taught her, Florence Price, piano. There's a great history as you take a look around this time period, again after the Civil War, which is 1865, and the Reconstruction period that followed, a great history of having an emphasis around education being one that can provide upward economic mobility for Black people, and for to highly regard being an educator. So Florence Price herself, a phenomenal organist, a phenomenal pianist, was also a passionate educator. And again, this was instilled as the nature of the time. Lots of theorists that you also probably have heard of or read of, W.E.B. Du Bois, who talked a lot about the feeling of education and providing this sort of economic and mobility, upward mobility for African Americans. She also grew up very much related in the church, so she had exposure already to a lot of what would be spirituals and stories and histories as it relates to Black culture. And she also had experience as it relates to sort of Western European classical music, what we consider Western European classical music. She was one who was sort of a child prodigy. Again, her mother taught her piano, and at the age of 11, had her first composition performed. She ended up eventually, again, fantastic pianist and organist, studying at New England Conservatory, which is my alma mater in Boston. New England Conservatory, Boston Conservatory, Oberlin Conservatory in Ohio, as well as the Chicago College, were four schools at around the 1865, 1867, so right after Civil War, that allowed women and Black women, Black people, I should say, to enroll in their schools. So you'll have at around this time a pretty big influx, especially in Boston, with two of those four schools being here, where people like Florence Price, people like William Grant Still, maybe another name that you might also know from Little Rock, Arkansas, coming to study and having a community in which that they can learn and which they can perform in. So she came to Boston, eventually moved back to Little Rock, Arkansas to be a teacher. There was, in the 1920s, just a general sense of history, so much racial discrimination as it relates to lynching, as it relates to hate crimes, as it relates to reincarnated Jim Crow laws and things like this, so that she and her husband at the time and small family had to move to Chicago during this great migration in the early 1920s. Chicago, very much during this time, was a parallel to the Harlem Renaissance, right? So you had this huge wave, 6 million Black people coming from the South to the North, some settling in Chicago, some settling in New York, some settling out west, and forming these communities. So Florence Price and her community in Chicago counted Margaret Bonds, another beautiful composer, as being her student and a mentor, Langston Hughes as being a friend whose poetry she would set, and Marian Anderson, a fantastic singer, being able to give her music to sing. So there was very much a community within Chicago that she was able to tap into and that she was able to also lead. It was in Chicago in 1932 that she won the Wanamaker Prize, which was actually a prize specifically for African Americans. She won first and second place, and her student, Margaret Bonds, also won first place in a different category. And as a prize, she received $500. I don't know what that amounts to in sort of today's day and age, but she received a cash prize as well as a world premiere of her piece, which was her first symphony by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. She then became, because of this prize-winning competition, she then became the first African American to have a major U.S. orchestra perform her work. With a success such as this, eventually as a single mother of two children, being an educator and a composer, very much her life was ingrained in music, and her economics was ingrained in music. She very much had to fight to be able to get her music performed on stages. And I wanted to share just an example of one such struggle that she had to face, which was not atypical of the time, but one that was very much central to the time. You may have heard of this also, this letter to who was then the Boston Symphony Orchestra conductor, Koussevitzky, in 1943. I'll just read this letter to you, and then we'll listen to a bit of her music. She writes, "To begin with, I have two handicaps, those of sex and race. I am a woman, and I have some Negro blood in my veins. Knowing the worst, then, would you be good enough to hold and check the possible inclination to regard woman's composition as long on emotionalism but short on virility, and thought content until you shall have examined some of my work? meaning I'm a woman, I'm Black, yes, let's put that center face, but forget about it. Can you take a look at my music? As to the handicap of race, may I relieve you by saying that I neither expect nor ask any concession on that score. I should like to be judged on merit alone, literally my music. The great trouble having been to get conductors who know nothing of my work to even consent to examine a score. So this very much viewing Black women and therefore viewing less quality. She says one that is emotionalism, one that is short on thought content. Those were the attitudes at the time that she was up against. Could you still acknowledge my music and still acknowledge my merit? Needless to say, Klusevitsky did not program her music, and it would be 76 years later, March 2019, just last year, when the BSO would perform one movement of Florence Price. I wanted to share a little bit of music, since I think her music really speaks for itself on all sorts of influences that she drew from. So again, this sort of Western classical tradition, you'll hear a string quartet, which is from my ensemble actually, and you'll hear the juba movement of her string quartet. Juba is a type of an African dance that uses a lot of body movement. You'll also hear, if you dig a little bit deeper with Florence Price, a lot of spirituals, or a lot of idioms as they relate to spirituals, something called pentatonic scales, which have 5 notes, and sort of melodies that are pretty small in the space between the notes, or the interval of a third, and being very embracing of her African American identity, which is something that, again, at this time, is very much community building. All right, so I'll play a little bit, and then if there's any questions. I find her music to be one that is very nostalgic, one that is warm and sort of embracing, that's very specific to a certain time period. I imagine when I hear some of her music, when I listen, and also when I play, that I am in some sort of open field with some sweet tea and it's sunny and surrounded by sunflowers or something like this. Something that's again very, very location specific and very time period specific. A question about other recommendations of her work, specific pieces? Sure. Well, you can listen to that prize winning piece, the Symphony in E minor, which is her first symphony. She also has a number, just so many. Again, she had Langston Hughes and Marian Anderson as friends. So many of art songs. There's a whole collection, 44 art songs and spirituals by Florence Price. You can hear recordings with Leontine Price and also Marian Anderson singing "My Soul's Been Anchored in the Lord," which was kind of one of her signatures. There's beautiful recordings, vocal again of her with countertenor Daryl Taylor singing "Night," which is a piece that I very much love as well, and just a whole slew of vocal repertoire. There's the African American Art Song Alliance, which is a phenomenal organization again run by Daryl Taylor, and you can just thumb through literally dozens and dozens and dozens of art songs. As a string player, I'm certainly partial to her string writing. So, in addition to this string quartet in A minor, which is about 30 minutes, she has a string quartet in G, which is unfinished, only in two movements. She has a beautiful violin sonata for violinists and pianists out there to be able to perform as well too. In addition to other symphonic and piano works, herself being a pianist and organist, has a piano concerto, a beautiful picture I don't have to share with you of her conducting with Margaret Bonds, her student and friend, playing the piano premiere in Chicago. Any organist out there, hopefully you are well versed in some of her organ repertoire, which is difficult and monstrous and gorgeous. The URL for the Alliance, I don't have the website, but if you search African American Art Song Alliance, you should be able to find that. Uh, there you go. Yes. And then also for anyone on Facebook, you can find their Facebook page. It's a quite active group um, between Daryl Taylor and lyric soprano Louise Toppin leading the charge. Both of them are very, very active in making sure that there is a um, active presence when it comes to vocal music, specifically by Black composers. Great, thank you, Sarah, for finding finding that link. I'll continue on with another composer who I personally love, who has a different relationship with um, the sort of overlap as we were talking about earlier, this context of gender and race. So Undine Smith Moore was born a little bit later than Florence Price, but certainly had some overlap with her as well. She's known as being the dean of African American composers, and for anyone else who is as much of a sort of history buff, you might have a name that's familiar, which is William Grant Still, who is often regarded as being the dean of African American composers, not African American women composers. Both sort of names are to acknowledge their presence and their legacy. So for Undine Smith Moore specifically, her legacy it's in a few different very specific ways, realized in a few different specific ways, one of which is that she was an educator at Virginia State College, which is now Virginia State University, for 45 years, which is mind blowing to me to think of being in one space, first of all, for that a period of time. And for any educators out there, it's hard work, and she was definitely committed to it. Um, for reasons which I had alluded to earlier with W.E.B. Du Bois, and again, this feeling of upward mobility as a community. So education is one way in which we can really, as a community, do this and be mentors to one another. So she very much instilled this. So she had a whole collective of over these multiple decades of students that she mentored. She, like Florence Price, was a pianist and organist, and like Florence Price, also was very attracted to spirituals, and so she has, as also one who is very interested in vocal music as well, so many arrangements of spirituals, so many choral pieces of spirituals, and if not direct references to, then ones that sort of allude to, but she very much is known for being a choral based composer. Also at Virginia State University, she helped found the Center for Black Music. The Center for Black Music, I think was what that was specifically called. And it really lasted her tenure being there. So again, being one who was very active in people's minds, quite literally, for 45 years, and also really fostering this space where black culture music could be discussed and could be celebrated. So she is rightly deserving of this name of Dean of African American composers. She has training from Fisk University, which was, along with Howard University, I believe, a historical black university that opened really right after the Civil War during Reconstruction time in the late 1860s. Again, very much about, as community, as black people, let's mentor one another. She also had studies in New York at Juilliard, at Manhattan, at Columbia University, in Mine Ho Town, which was Rochester, New York, at Eastman School of Music. You can see in her compositional style how things sort of shifted a little bit. So in the 50s, 1950s, with the rise of sort of the civil rights movement, 50s and 60s, she became very more engaged with black centric. So putting spirituals front and center into her music as opposed to sort of alluding to it before. And of her 100 compositions or so, about a third of them set spirituals. Prior to that, and I have a piece to share with you all, her style was one that was really quite pointillistic, was really serialistic for those that are familiar with that term, really one that had a lot of dissonance in it. She, and I'll just share in her own words because her own words are powerful. When speaking about race and ethnicity and speaking about blackness, she said that black music, to emphasize that black music is a house of many mansions. Black people have many musics, and some of them relate in an extremely universal way to the human condition. So she was very much one with her voice as an educator to advocate for the diversity as it relates to black music and also to black composers, to not being monolithic on that sort of single axis that Kimberly Crenshaw had talked about. Of women, she noted that for a long time in the past, women were indoctrinated, or people, I should say, were indoctrinated with a widely held belief that the abstract is not within a woman's sphere. So the creative and the intangible and composing music, it's not for women. And the ability to transmute inner sources by giving them artistic form is a discipline suitable only to men. So taking this intangible, putting it into art form, was known, was regarded in her time as being for men. So she very much had to defy that as a composer. And speaking of that, when she was asked if she would consider herself devoting fully to being a composer, her response, which I think is very telling of the time and maybe one that could still resonate in some ways today, her response was, "This question was surely written for men. Their wives assume those dreary responsibilities which make it possible for them to compose. It would be fine to have a life so ordered that other everyday responsibilities did not impinge so heavily on my time." So as a woman, so many other things compounded with being a woman just were prohibitive for her to fully devote herself to something that is so creative and just sort of dream up, music all day long, type of a situation. There's certainly, I think we can appreciate situations that today, in a variety of different ways, are impeding on someone's creative time, whether it's socially, whether it's related to class, whether it's related to gender, whether it's related to race. Um, I want to play a little bit of music of Undine Smith Moore, and this one is called Before I'd Be a Slave, which has it takes its name from "Oh Freedom," which is an African American spiritual, which says, "Oh freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom over me, and before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave, and go home to my Lord and be free." Um, she took this line from this spiritual, which I always knew the spiritual to be one that is a jubilee, one that's a celebration. Literally, before I become someone else's subject, I am going to be free. I'm going to go home. I have power and strength in this knowledge. And taking the sort of power and strength from this song, this spiritual, she created this piece, which is for solo piano, and I'll play it for you now. I'll scroll through a bit. So with this, I wanted to read read a quick excerpt from Helen Walker Hill, scholar Helen Walker Hill, who was the former wife of George Walker, who passed away a few years ago, Pulitzer Prize winning African American composer. From Spirituals to Symphonies, African American women composers and their music. That particular piece sounds probably nothing like the brief excerpt that I sang for you, but she would have called this piece, instead of Before I Be a Slave, Warrior. Of this music, Helen Walker Hill notes that the music expresses the frustration and rage of its program, from the opening intense drum tone clusters in the bass register to the furiously pounded tone clusters at the end. Many passages sweep from one extreme of the keyboard to the other, and dynamics range from very, very soft to very, very loud. It's the most violent of all of Undine Smith Moore's composition, although apparently it wasn't the only such work. And again, one that, instead of being called Before I'd Be a Slave, which talks about the sort of power of this knowledge, she would have called that Warrior. No longer still with us, but one who has, I think, very, very powerful music. Other examples of her music, the life of scenes from the life of a martyr, which are sort of an oratorio kind of a setting, centered around the life of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, without necessarily referencing them specifically, but very much, again, associating her music very clearly with her race. She has a beautiful Afro-American, suite, which is a chamber piece. Similar, sort of, I guess, a name to William Grant Still's Afro-American Symphony, which both of them very much draw from African American idiom. So very integral to her identity as a composer, was, and very much in celebration, her race. Yeah, so Rob, in the chat, as a music theorist and teacher, having examples of serial music that's not Schoenberg, Weber, and Berg, sort of the three that we know, would be fantastic. So in her early period, like this one, which was in her earlier period, you see quite a bit of influence from the nature of the time, which was serial and which was dissonant music. So yeah, I think definitely taking a look at this piano piece and other compositions that are around this particular time period in her life. And this particular anthology, if you don't have it already, I would highly recommend it. It has a whole listing of music in chronological order and biographical information, that kind of thing. So you can find it in here. And there was another question about Florence Price and her chamber music. She's not listed in here, although I think some of her chamber music is. But Clarenon editions, and I may just, Joel, I was trying to type to you, and then I ended up stopping the music. But Clarenon Editions, which is now owned with Vocal Reprints, a publishing company, has quite a bit of her chamber music. And then if you're interested, any conductors out there, Schirmer, publisher, has acquired a good deal of her symphonic music. But you can find some of her chamber, this is Florence Price, some of her chamber music, really with Clarenon Editions, which is now part of Vocal Reprints. Great. So I have two more, and I think I might actually get to both of them, which is fantastic. I was explaining to Helen that usually I talk too much and run out of time. But I wanted to share a totally different story of how this intersectionality related to this particular composer, Julia Perry. So we've started in the late 1800s with Florence Price, moved to the early 1900s, and now at around the time of Great Depression, when Julia Perry was born, that Great Migration, moving later into time. So Julia Perry was born in Kentucky and then later moved to Akron, Ohio, where, according to accounts that I have read, she grew up in a place that was described as a cordial racial atmosphere where Black and white families lived side by side. To know that there was a place where she felt comfortable, where she felt I guess, assimilated, where she didn't feel like, and she is noted for speaking on this, she didn't feel like she had racial discrimination growing up, and had been subject to this. So very much with Julia Perry's story, especially early on in her life, feeling as though she wanted to sort of separate blackness, so traditional African American spirituals, for instance, in her music. Because why does she feel attachment to that? It wasn't one that she had necessarily grown up with. And for her, she very much wanted to aspire to um, aspire to what was a style and a stature that was not synonymous with blackness, I guess I could say. Um, and I won't get too far into this, but this also goes into, for those that are familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois and his concept of talented tenth, where there is a small percentage that will sort of carry the community upward, has an ability to create that sort of schism between upper and lower, or high. We know this in music, high art versus low art type of a thing. And Julia Perry, I think, was sort of part of this idea of, and she again speaks on this, of not trying to associate herself with a lower Negro class. She, growing up, won a scholarship to the Cleveland Institute of Music. Again, she was born in Akron, or not born, but she moved to Akron, which is about 45 minutes away. Her parents thought it was too far for her to go to Cleveland Institute of Music, and sort of putting myself in her time period, maybe it was too far. Maybe if she was in this sort of idyllic bubble where black and white could live in harmony, driving 45 minutes through who knows what to get to Cleveland could have been quite dangerous. Or it could have been other situations, other circumstances, I'm not quite sure. But in any case, she turned down a scholarship to CIM to go to Westminster Choir College in Princeton, New Jersey, which is obviously more than 45 minutes away from Akron, and studied composition, voice, piano, violin, dramatics, which I understand to be as theater, and also conducting. By the time she graduated undergrad, she had one piece that was published by Carl Fisher. It was a choral piece, and very much wanted to set herself on a track to being a serious composer. With respects to her education, she spent 3 summers at the Tanglewood Institute, which I'm sure we all have heard of, which is out in western Massachusetts in the Berkshires. During that time at Tanglewood, she became a student of Della Piccolo, who very much took her under his wing and helped encourage her as a mentor and a mentee, a mentor to a mentee. Her piece Stabat Mater, which I won't play for you, but one that I'll encourage you to check out on your own, was premiered at Tanglewood, and was one that sort of jump started her career. For those that came in right at 7, I was playing a little bit of music in the background, and that was a piece by Julia Perry called Study for Orchestra. I abruptly ended it. Sorry for some of those that came on a little bit later, but that gives you a little bit of a sense, if you remember from at the top of this deep dive, the sound of Julia Perry. She ended up living abroad for a brief time period on 2 separate Guggenheim fellowships, one to study with Della Piccolo in Italy, and another to study with Nadia Boulanger, who was a mentor to so many contemporary composers in France. So she was one who very much wanted to envelope herself in a avant-garde contemporary Western classical world. And again, if you can think back to the piece that I played before at the top of the class, it sounds jarring and really doesn't have overt, spirituals, for instance, or those pentatonic scales, or repetitive melodic thirds that you may find in a lot of vocal music and gospel music, for instance. It doesn't have that in her music, because again, she was very much wanting to try to divide that aspect of herself, until the again, the 50s and 60s, when she was living abroad and sort of looking back at her home country with civil rights, with various um, unfortunate newsworthy events of lynching, of sit-ins, of uproar, racial uproar going on in her country, did she feel called to turn to being political in her music and infusing some of the um, sort of finding alignment, I guess, with that. So she has a few things sort of post 1950s, 60s that sort of mark this shift in her positioning. One is her Symphony Number 5, which is called Integration Symphony. From 1972, she wrote Soul Symphony, which has sort of descriptors of to be played in like a bluesy style, and created a kind of a play on race, class, and gender. So three of those intersectionality Venn diagram points we had talked about in the 1969. That was called Fistini, and it touches on great Black heroes like Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King Jr., racial equity, educational relevance, the sort of personal pet peeve that she had around calling Black and Native American Indian culture as being ethnic as opposed to being ingrained into this country. Um, and again, in her later lives, kind of at the turn of the civil rights movement, sort of married this feeling of being vocal as a black woman. I have, I think, a quick excerpt I wanted to read again from. I think I'll actually no. I think I'll skip this. I was going to read just a quick excerpt as it relates to that play, but I think that's enough to give you a context of sort of who she was and the outside factors that helped guide her thinking. Sheila had asked, were the fellowships for composing or for a particular instrument? They were for composing, so she was studying composition in Italy and in France. You can also note from the slides here that due to a stroke that she had in the 1970s, she lost mobility in the right side of her body and was wheelchair bound. So again, thinking back to that Venn diagram, we now have race, gender, and disability as being overlaps. She, in her later life, these last sort of 9 years of her life, really expressed a lot of desperation, and you can see that in her writing, which runs. Her handwritten scores run from very legible early on to completely illegible as she was trying so desperately to still write music and to still sort of call upon friends and call upon publishers like, please play my music, please make me feel that I still have relevance in this particular time of my life. So her small body of work that is surviving 54 again ranges from legible to really illegible due to this stroke. I have one more that I would love to share with you, and I do have a little bit of audio for Dorothy Woodmore, who is still alive, and I would love to maybe quickly talk a little bit about her and then end with some of her music, and if anyone has any other final questions, I think we can maybe try to do all of that in the last 4 minutes that we have. So Dorothy Woodmore, similar to Julia Perry, kind of grew up in a small idyllic town. There were maybe 2,000 people in that town, black and white, and sort of people all kind of knew each other, or they were maybe a cousin removed from. I don't. Sorry for the background noise. I think someone is in the bathroom, so I can't get rid of that static sound. I'm so sorry. But in any case, she grew up in a community that knew each other. She, like Florence Price, grew up in the church, and the church was the black church was one that also, in addition to what we consider black music, was very much playing and promoting classical music. So she had an early access to both. Um, a great story that I'd love to share about her was that when she was quite young, she learned clarinet. She had a friend teach her clarinet so that she could become the first woman to play in her school um, all boy band. So she, from the early days, wanted to insert herself. She also attended a historical black university, Howard University, also studied with Nadia Boulanger in France. And it was really, for Dorothy Woodmore, Julia Perry. She was the first black woman composer that she saw and gave her representation to think, okay, I can actually do this. And both of them have similarities in their upbringing and also with whom they studied. I want to end with some music. The final points that I'll share about Dorothy Woodmore: still alive. She was married to a cellist, so her compositions, which are about 35, you'll see a lot of them involving, especially the chamber pieces involving cello. Her husband Kermit Moore being one of the cellists that she would very much write for. A few of my favorite works that I'll highlight before we take a listen. Flowers of Darkness is a vocal piece that she wrote where the poetry is from African American men that are speaking of their sort of admiration and affection for African American women, which is not necessarily a pointed narrative that we hear a lot, I guess. And then also her opera, Frederick Douglass, which is, as you can imagine from the name, about Frederick Douglass. What I will play for you now is actually a aria from that opera. Okay, I think that is it. That's all the time that we have for um, today. But I hope this was informative. I hope if you have any questions, you can connect with me. I'll put my email in the chat. And as I think it's probably already advertised, other sessions around different topics as it relates to African American composers and their legacies next month with early pioneers, and then in December around African American spiritual tradition. So thank you so much for joining.